He looked like just another passenger with a carry-on, until the gate agent learned who he really was, and by then, it was far too late. A bustling airport terminal, the kind where the air hums with equal parts exhaustion and anticipation. Rolling suitcases click against the polished floor, boarding announcements echo through the PA system, and a steady stream of travelers pushes toward the gates. Amid this tide of humanity stood Marcus Ellison, 6'2", tailored navy suit, a calm presence that seemed almost out of place in the chaos. To most, he looked like a man on his way to an important meeting. In reality, he was one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in the country, a man whose business ventures had created hundreds of jobs and generated millions in revenue. But none of that mattered to the woman behind the boarding counter. She didn't know his name, or maybe she did and simply didn't care. What she saw was skin color first and everything else second. Marcus approached the gate with the quiet efficiency of someone who had traveled thousands of times before. Boarding pass ready, ID in hand, polite smile on his face. The gate agent, a white woman in her late 40s with a clipped tone and eyes that scanned him up and down like a security scanner, barely glanced at his documents before shaking her head. "This flight is full," she said flatly. Marcus looked down at the boarding pass again, then back at her. "I'm in first class, seat 2A, he replied evenly. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "I said it's full. You'll have to take it up with customer service." Behind him, passengers were still boarding, white passengers. He watched them hand over their passes and be waved through without a word. A young white man in jeans and a hoodie, boarding pass in one hand and a coffee in the other, was welcomed with a bright smile. A white woman in yoga pants, juggling. A toddler and a diaper bag was helped with warmth and patience. Marcus stepped aside, trying to keep his composure. He had lived through enough to know this wasn't about seating arrangements or flight capacity. It was about perception, about the quick, silent judgment that could open doors for some and slam them shut for others. The minutes ticked by, each one sharpening the insult. He approached again, this time after nearly all passengers had boarded. "Can I speak to a supervisor?" he asked. She sighed dramatically, picked up the phone, and spoke in a low voice. A man in a dark blazer appeared, glanced between Marcus and the agent, and said, "Sir, you'll have to rebook. We've already given your seat away." "Given it away?" Marcus's voice was calm but firm. "I checked in 2 hours ago." Then, "You should have been here earlier," the man replied, his tone dismissive. Marcus knew arguing would only feed their version of the story, the angry black man trope they were likely itching to invoke. So he gathered his dignity, turned, and walked away. But unbeknownst to them, this wasn't the end of the story. This was the opening scene in a chain of events that would shake the airline to its core. As Marcus moved through the terminal, memories pressed in on him. Childhood moments when his parents had to explain why store clerks followed them, why police cruisers slowed when they drove through certain neighborhoods, why his father always dressed in a suit for flights. "We have to be twice as good, son," his father had told him, "twice as prepared, and sometimes even that won't be enough." By the time Marcus reached the airline's executive lounge, his mind was already moving in the measured, strategic way that had built his empire. The receptionist at the lounge recognized him immediately. He was a Platinum Elite member, after all, and ushered him to a private seating area. He didn't rage. He didn't vent. Instead, he made a single phone call. "Cynthia, I need you to clear my afternoon," he said into the phone. "And I need the number for Richard Coleman, the COO of Continental Vista Airlines." Cynthia, his assistant of nearly a decade, didn't ask why. She just said, "On it." Marcus sat back, the gears in his mind turning. What the gate agent didn't know, what the supervisor didn't know, was that Marcus's investment firm was in final negotiations to purchase a significant stake in the holding company that owned their airline. He had been on his way to New York for the closing meeting. 15 minutes later, Richard Coleman answered the phone. "Marcus, I was expecting to see you in person today." "You still might," Marcus said, his tone even. "But first, I need to tell you about an incident that just happened at your Denver gate." Coleman listened in silence as Marcus laid out the details, his voice precise and unshaken. He didn't embellish, didn't speculate, just recounted the facts, the refusal to board, the contradictory acceptance of white passengers, and the dismissive tone of the supervisor. There was a long pause on the other end. "Marcus, I am deeply sorry. This is unacceptable. I don't want an apology," Marcus interrupted gently. "I want accountability, and we're about to have a very different conversation about my investment." Coleman knew the weight behind those words. Marcus's firm didn't just buy shares, they reshaped companies. They installed new leadership, rewrote policies, and restructured operations. And when they found rot, they cut it out without hesitation. Somewhere back at gate C-23, the gate agent had likely moved on, already dealing with the next passenger, blissfully unaware that her 15-second decision had just triggered a seismic shift in the company's future. Marcus looked out over the tarmac, watching planes taxi into position. His father's voice echoed again. "Twice as good, son. And when they still try to hold you back, make sure you own the gate they're guarding." This time, Marcus wasn't just going to own the gate. He was going to own the whole runway. Marcus Ellison was a man who believed in patience, but not in letting injustice pass unchallenged. By the time Richard Coleman hung up the phone, Marcus's plan was already unfolding. He called Cynthia again. "Get me our legal team, corporate communications, and the acquisitions division on a conference line. 5 minutes." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. People who worked with Marcus knew that when his tone was calmest, he was most dangerous. As he waited, Marcus stared out the lounge's panoramic glass window, watching a Continental Vista plane glide down the runway. It was an impressive machine, efficient, sleek, perfectly engineered. But like the company that owned it, its perfection was only skin deep. He thought of the millions of black travelers who had endured slights and humiliations in airports across the country. People who had no power to fight back, whose voices were dismissed as overreacting or playing the race card. But Marcus wasn't just another passenger. He was a man holding a multi-million-dollar decision in his hands, one that could shift the future of the airline itself. The conference line clicked alive. "Marcus, we're here," said Janine, his chief legal officer. "Good," Marcus replied. "Here's what happened at gate C-23. He laid out the story again, every word measured, every detail exact. When he was finished, there was silence. On the line. "This is systemic," Janine said finally. "If it happened to you, it's happening to others. We can use this to demand structural change." "Not demand," Marcus corrected. "Enforce. I want a full civil rights audit of Continental Vista. Every hiring practice, every customer service protocol, every complaint record for the past 10 years. And if we're putting money into this company, I want the authority to execute the results." "You're talking about rewriting their corporate DNA," said Kevin, head of acquisitions. "I'm talking about not letting my people be treated like second-class citizens in an industry they help keep alive," Marcus answered. In another corner of the airport, the gate agent from earlier was probably sipping a coffee, satisfied with herself for handling a passenger she'd silently labeled as trouble. Marcus wasn't thinking about her anymore. He was thinking about the thousands of employees, the stockholders, and the board members who would soon realize that one discriminatory decision had just cost them far more than they could imagine. By the time Marcus boarded a different airline's flight to New York, the gears of power were turning fast. His legal team had drafted a memo outlining the conditions for the acquisition. His communications team was preparing a statement, not for the public, not yet, but for the airline's board of directors. it would be the first warning shot. When Marcus landed, a black SUV whisked him straight to a glass skyscraper in Midtown. In a private boardroom on the 42nd floor, the senior leadership of Continental Vista was waiting. The CEO, a tall man with silver hair and an impeccable suit, rose to greet him. "Marcus, I heard there was some incident," he began cautiously. "Incident is one word for it," Marcus replied, setting his leather briefcase on the table. "I call it a liability." He didn't waste time with small talk. He slid a printed copy of the legal memo across the table. "These are the terms. If you want our investment, this becomes policy immediately. Non-negotiable." The CEO glanced at the first page, his brow furrowing. "This calls for terminating the gate agent and supervisor. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, a diversity review of senior leadership, and an independent oversight committee with veto power on hiring decisions." Marcus leaned back. "That's just page 1. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. The COO, Richard Coleman, avoided eye contact. Marcus had warned him. Now the warning was reality. One director tried to object. "With all due respect, Mr. Ellison, this seems like an overreaction to one misunderstanding." Marcus fixed him with a look that made the room feel colder. "A misunderstanding is when you lose a boarding pass. What happened at gate C23 is discrimination. It's not about me. It's about what it says to every other black passenger who walks up to your counter." He let the words hang there. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then Marcus pressed. "The advantage. You need my capital. You need the network I bring. And I don't need this deal, not unless it aligns with my values. So you have a choice. Either Continental Vista becomes a leader in equity and dignity for all passengers, or you find another investor while your reputation rots from the inside." The CEO closed the folder, his face unreadable. "We'll have to discuss." "You have 1 hour," Marcus cut in. "At 3 p.m., I walk out, and the acquisition collapses. And the first phone call I make will be to the journalists who've been waiting for a story exactly like this." He wasn't bluffing. In his line of work, credibility was currency, and Marcus Ellison had never been one to make empty threats. They gave him their answer in 45 minutes. The deal would proceed on his terms, every single one. But Marcus wasn't done. "One more thing," he added as the papers were signed. "The gate at Denver International? Shut it down for a full day. Every staff member on duty that morning will undergo immediate retraining. You'll make a public statement explaining why." The CEO hesitated. "That will cause a disruption." "That's the point," Marcus said evenly. "Disruption is how you get people's attention." That evening, news outlets began receiving a carefully worded press release from Continental Vista Airlines. It spoke of renewed commitments to diversity and equity, swift and decisive internal reforms, and a personal incident that reminded us of the work still to be done. It didn't name Marcus, but insiders knew. The travel industry knew. And somewhere in Denver, the gate agent from C23 was opening an email marked "Mandatory Attendance, Bias and Customer Respect Training." She didn't know yet that her name was on an internal watch list, her actions documented, her future at the airline uncertain. Marcus didn't celebrate. This wasn't about personal victory. This was about setting a precedent. He knew change in corporate culture was slow, and one policy wouldn't erase decades of bias. But it was a start, and for him, starts were non-negotiable. As he looked out over the city lights from his penthouse that night, Marcus thought of his father again. The man had never flown first class in his life. Not because he couldn't afford it, but because he'd never wanted to risk the humiliation. That would never be Marcus's story. And if he could help it, it wouldn't be the story of anyone who came after him. The morning after the deal closed, headlines began appearing on business blogs and travel industry forums. Major airline implements sweeping anti-bias reforms after. Executive pushes for change. They didn't use Marcus's name, but his fingerprints were all over the transformation. Reporters began connecting dots. A high-profile investor with a history of socially conscious business practices had just taken a controlling stake in Continental Vista's parent company. An unnamed incident in Denver had triggered the changes. The story spread, partly because no airline had ever moved this fast on equity reforms without a lawsuit forcing their hand. By the end of the week, Continental Vista had launched a high-visibility public campaign called Every Passenger Matters. Television spots featured real customers telling their stories. Training modules were rolled out in every hub. Supervisors were given new authority and responsibility to stop discrimination at the gate before it started. But Marcus wasn't naive. He knew policy was one thing, practice was another. The real test would come when those same gate agents and supervisors had to choose, in the moment, whether to follow old habits or embrace the new standards. The first test came just days later. Video began circulating on social media. Grainy footage from a phone camera showing a black woman in her early 30s arguing with a gate agent at Los Angeles International. The caption read, "Same airline, different day. Some things never change. Only this time things did change." Halfway through the confrontation, a senior supervisor stepped in, reviewed the woman's boarding pass, and personally escorted her onto the plane with an apology. The video caught that too. And when it was posted online, the ending shocked viewers. Instead of a long thread of anger and hashtags calling for boycotts, there were comments like, "Looks like they're finally doing something, and I've flown with them for years. Never seen that before." Marcus watched the clip from his office and allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And it happened because people inside the company now knew that the culture had shifted, that the rules had changed at the top. The gate agent from Denver? She was gone. Officially, it was failure to adhere to customer service protocols, but everyone knew why. Marcus hadn't insisted on her firing. He believed in reform more than revenge. But when HR's investigation revealed she had multiple complaints for similar behavior, there was no defending her. Marcus's phone rang one afternoon, an unfamiliar number. When he answered, he heard an older male voice. "Mr. Ellison, this is James L. Carter. I don't know if you know my name, but I'm president of the National Black Pilots Association. I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't just fix one incident, you changed the conversation in our industry." Marcus felt the weight of those words. Pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, they all had their own stories. Stories of being passed over for promotions, of being told customers might feel more comfortable with someone else, of subtle comments that stung more than outright insults. Now, at least in one airline, there was a precedent for standing up. Weeks passed, and Marcus's reforms began to ripple beyond Continental Vista. Competing airlines quietly started their own diversity initiatives, not wanting to be left behind. Industry conferences began hosting panels on racial equity in air travel. A travel magazine ran a feature titled The Marcus Effect, naming him one of the most influential voices in modern aviation. But none of the awards or attention mattered as much as the moment he'd been waiting for. It came 3 months later, when Marcus took a flight back to Denver, the same airport where Gate C-23 had once been a symbol of humiliation. This time, he wasn't traveling for business. He was there for family. His father, now 74, was finally taking the trip he had put off for decades, a first-class flight to see the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. Marcus met him at the check-in counter. "You sure about this, Dad?" he teased gently. His father adjusted the brim of his hat. "I'm sure, and I'm ready." As they approached the gate, not C-23 but one nearby, a young black gate agent greeted them with a warm smile. "Mr. Ellison, welcome aboard," she said, shaking his father's hand. "We've been expecting you." It was a small gesture, but Marcus saw his father's eyes soften. There was no suspicion, no tension, no invisible weight pressing on his shoulders, just dignity. They walked down the jet bridge together. His father paused halfway and looked out the small oval window at the airplane's nose. "You know," his father said quietly, "when I told you to be twice as good, I never thought you'd make the rules." Marcus smiled. That was always the plan. Hours later, as the plane lifted into the sky, Marcus glanced at his father, leaning back in the wide leather seat, a glass of water in his hand, a quiet peace on his face. And Marcus realized this was more than a personal victory. It was a restoration, not just for one man, but for every person who had been told, in ways subtle and cruel, that they didn't belong. Airlines would still have problems. Bias wouldn't vanish overnight. But from now on, the people making those split-second judgments at the gate would know there was accountability, and that someone somewhere was watching. And for Marcus Ellison, that was enough to keep going.